moving on to our second three of our six vitamin B vitamins. Now, the vitamin B complex, as we know, is a family of vitamins. I suggested to you that you would study vitamin B1, thiamine, B2, riboflavin, and niacin, or vitamin B3 together. And I hope that you drew out your table on your A4 page and have, the common foods, functions, etc., and then in one colour, and then the slight differences in another. So certainly learn B1, B2 and niacin together. Now the other three, B6, B9 and B12, unfortunately I would say that these would cause way too much confusion if you were to try and learn them together. So we're going to treat them individually, but there's a lot of similarities, I suppose, with the first three. Now, again, it's one of those chapters, unfortunately, that you have to sit down and learn off. I don't think there's any other chapter in home economics that's quite like it. So hopefully you're learning them early on in the year. Now, pyridoxine. Pyridoxine has never been asked on the exam paper, either on a short question or a long question. Is that to say that it would never be asked? Absolutely not. So we need to keep an eye. So one thing that's very easy though is pyridoxine, or vitamin B6, is found in most basic foods. We said before that we should learn 6 foods for each vitamin in order to be completely covered. So if you write down most basic foods, you can pretty much get away with any food: meat, fish, bread, and so on. So I'm going with fish, meat, eggs, milk, cereals, and fruit. Now, not citrus fruit, but particularly bananas. So we'll say fruit like bananas, and there are 6 sources. We said that we should always learn 4 functions. Now, one thing we're going to see with these 3 vitamins, B6, B9, B12, is that they all work together along with iron. Now, we've not studied the mineral chapter just yet, so I'd strongly advise that when you have your mineral chapter covered, to go back up here, particularly to the B6, B9 and B12. So B6, B9 and B12, that is pyridoxine, folate, folic acid and cobalamin. They work with iron in order to make red blood cells in the body. So that would say to us, if I'm deficient in any of these 3 vitamins, B6, B9, B12, I could end up with a condition called anemia. And on our course, we refer to 3 different types of anemia. So first of all, we note, I'm going to take a highlighter here, and we know that B6 or cobalamin, or B6, pyridoxine, happens to be a coenzyme. Now, at the offset of this particular chapter, we said a common characteristic of all B vitamins is that they're all coenzymes. So just to remind yourselves, what are coenzymes? Coenzymes will help other nutrients release their energy more efficiently without providing energy themselves. For example, they are all coenzymes for carbohydrate. And I mentioned to you about Berocca, an effervescent tablet. Drop it in water, fizzes up, and if we take Berocca, supposedly we're going to have lots and lots of energy. But the energy is not coming from the B vitamins themselves in the Berocca tablet. Once we ingest all of these B vitamins, the carbohydrate we've consumed in our diet, the energy is released more efficiently, and so we get this boost of energy. However, we know that the B vitamins have slight differences, or have, certain unique individual properties. And the thing about vitamin B6 or pyridoxine, yes, it is a coenzyme for carbohydrate, but also it is specifically a coenzyme for protein, i.e. vitamin B6 pyridoxine helps protein to release its energy more efficiently. Note, a healthy nervous system. that we have noticed now has been a common thread through all 4 vitamins so far, B1, B2, niacin and B6. Next, I'm going to highlight formation of structural proteins. Now, structural proteins, the last time we referred to those was our protein handout. Remember, we had the biological functions of protein, and I said to you, don't learn biological functions of protein off in a list. You need to learn them under 3 headings: physiologically active protein, nutrient proteins and structural proteins. And we mentioned structural protein like keratin. Now, keratin is a structural protein in nails, hair and skin, but we also know that it's needed, B6 is needed to make it. So I'm just going to highlight keratin there in skin, but also in nails and in hair. And I don't think we should leave out this one, and that is works with B12 iron, and we should change that slightly there. So I'm just going to move that to B9. So put a B9 there at the beginning of that. So B9. So B9, B12, iron and B6 all work together. I'll just write it here to clarify. So B9, B12 and iron plus B6 are needed to make red blood cells. Deficiency, we've said before that we learn 4. Now, deficiency is very rare. Why? Obviously, it's found in most basic foods. So the only reason that you would be deficient in B6 if you weren't eating enough food. So it's rare, but it can cause, we'll back to our highlighter here, convulsions in infants, weak nails and hair and skin problems, because that connects back to the fact that we need B6 to make keratin. Insomnia, which we know is sleeplessness, where people keep waking up at regular intervals throughout the night. And then, like I said earlier, lack of B6, B9, B12 can lead to anemia, but there are 3 types. And this type of anemia is called macrocytic anemia. Now, macrocytic anemia, macro large. So we have, with macrocytic anemia, you have larger red blood cells, but they happen to be fewer in number, and therefore less oxygen or less hemoglobin, and therefore less oxygen is picked up. Now, like I said, we'll be moving on to the chapter on minerals, and you do have to come back to these 3 B vitamins. So we'll talk more about hemoglobin picking up oxygen in our chapter on minerals. And finally then, for pyridoxine, we have to have 4 properties. Like before, water soluble, happens to be fairly heat stable, may be lost in thawing. Now, as frozen food thaws, we're all familiar with that. You can see this kind of bloody water, say, coming out of meat. And there is actually a special name given to that liquid, and it is called drip loss. And we're saying now that as that frozen food is thawing, as the water comes out, some of the water-soluble vitamins are lost, like B6. And then we have our final one there, affected by oxygen. You'll be glad to know that there's no need to learn RDAs or RDIs, whichever you like to refer to them as, according to the syllabus. So just really a quick recap there. Pyridoxine, never been asked before. It is on the course. You are honour students, so therefore you need to keep an eye. Most basic foods, 6 functions, 4 properties, 4 effects of deficiency, and 4 biological functions. And just to be aware that pyridoxine works very closely with our next two vitamins, B9 and B12 and iron, to make red blood cells, and deficiency will always lead to some form of anemia. And in the case of vitamin B6, the type of anemia is called macrocytic. Right, folic acid, folate, B9. Now, this actually was up quite recently, and it was on the 2024 exam. I'm so happy to see it, because prior to that, it hadn't been asked since 2007. A reminder there again, you're not going to get away with studying exam papers for the last 10 years. This course has been, I suppose, been taught for the last 20 years, since 2004. So basically, any question over the last 20 years is liable to be repeated again. So it was 2007 question 1B, and then 17 years on, 2024, it came up on question 2B, and it was worth 18 marks. That's huge. That's 4.5% of the Leaving Cert grade in 2024 was just on this one vitamin. Just to give you a little bit of backstory on folate and folic acid. Back in 2006 in Ireland, Micheál Martin, who you know as our Taoiseach, Micheál Martin was the Minister for Health. He actually introduced the non-smoking ban. But either way, Micheál Martin noticed that there were too many babies being born in Ireland, which are called, which had neural tube defects, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And he set up this committee to see would they examine the possibility of what's called mandatory fortification of bread, whereby food manufacturers or manufacturers of bread would have to add folic acid to the bread. The committee agreed that that would be a good idea. It never actually came to fruition. Many felt that maybe it was mass medication and so on. Either way, that was in 2006. Guess what arrived up on our exam in 2007? Question 1B, the compulsory question, folic acid and folate. Now, that's not just coincidence, because there was so much talk, discussion, every GP surgery you went into, I'm old enough to tell you that, during 2006, 2007, had big posters on the wall, before you take, or before you plan pregnancy, take your folic acid. So it was very topical. And that's one aspect of this exam you need to be really, really conscious of, is that, of course, we're going to be asked actual content from the syllabus, but there are going to be questions which we'll be discussing. There are going to be questions that are related to what's going on in the world around us at a particular time. So that's when folic acid came up. Now, why am I calling B2 riboflavin and B1 thiamine and niacin, maybe B3? Why am I calling vitamin B9 folic acid? That's because there's two forms of vitamin B9. Folate is when vitamin B9 is naturally occurring in food. So if I eat an orange, an avocado, sliced brown bread, bit of red meat, the B9 is called folate. It's naturally occurring in that food. If I have a box, or not a box, if I were to eat a bowl of breakfast cereal, I might read the side of the packaging and it might say fortified with B vitamins, and B9 or folic acid is there. And like I mentioned, if you require folic acid to be increased in your diet, you may have to go to the pharmacy, like women planning pregnancy, and get what are called folic acid tablets. So folate is the naturally occurring form, which we're going to highlight here, and it's found in food, whereas folic acid is the supplement form, and we often see it fortified, or like that you can actually get supplements. So to be clear on that. Now, because it came up in 2024 and we are doing Leaving Cert 2025, I think it's perfectly safe to learn 3 sources, 3 functions, 3 deficiency, and 3 properties. In fact, the marking scheme in 2024, 18 marks, they wanted 3 sources, they wanted 3 properties, and 3 biological functions. So sources, I'm going with green leafy vegetables like spinach and kale. I'm going with dried beans like mung beans and pinto beans. And I'm going to go with, what will I go with? Avocados. One of my favourite things. Any students who know me know my love of avocados. Right, so there we go. There's our 3. Now functions, we definitely want the one where it works with B6 and B12 and to make red blood cells with iron. So I'm going to highlight that one for a start. So it works with B6, B12 and iron to make red blood cells. I also think I'm definitely going to include this one, and that is, we should all know, regardless of whether it come up in 24 or not, we need to, just for life in general, need to know about the role of folate, folic acid in the early stages of fetal development. To be more specific, we're talking about the first trimester or the first 3 months of pregnancy. Now, when we study iron, we will mention that iron is very important for the embryonic development, the neurological development in the embryo. Now, the unborn is referred to as an embryo up to 8 weeks. Post 8 weeks, the unborn baby is referred to as a fetus. Now, for most women, and I say most, normally the first time that they see a scan of their baby is around 3 months. It could be, the 13th or 14th week even of the pregnancy. And again, I'm not an artist, as you well know, but we will have the fetus in the womb. And along the back of the scan of the baby, along the back here, you'll see like a line, and this is called the neural tube. And what I'm saying to you is we need to have adequate folic acid as women in pregnancy. Now, ideally speaking, you want to have adequate folic acid in your blood from the moment of conception, because many women have irregular periods and they might know they're pregnant for 8 or 9 weeks. And the first 12 weeks of the pregnancy is really, really important for the neural tube development. So women planning pregnancy would be advised to actually take a supplement of folic acid, 400 micrograms a day, and ideally start taking that a couple of months before you plan to get pregnant, so that from the moment of conception there's adequate folic acid there. So what will happen as the pregnancy progresses, the top of the neural tube, there'll be 3 swellings, and those swellings will eventually form the brain. And if we move forward there, when we see pictures of the brain and all the wrinkly part, that is called it's the main part of the brain, the first part of the brain. It's called the cerebrum, and it fills the bony part of our skull, which is called the cranium. And then you have the rest of the brain, which we don't cover in home economics. Once upon a time we used to study physiology, which I thought was absolutely fantastic, to have physiology and home economics together. It just made so much sense. So either way, we have the brain and we have the spinal cord. And we know in the human body that the brain and the spinal cord are connected. The fluid that flows in the center of our spinal cord and around the brain and the meninges, that's called cerebrospinal fluid. So it all stems back from the neural tube. So the brain and the spinal cord are formed from that, and folic acid is really essential in the first 3 months of pregnancy, as is iron and to a lesser extent vitamin B12. So if a woman is really lacking in folic acid in those very early stages of her pregnancy, obviously then there could be a problem with the development of the neural tube, and you can end up getting what are called neural tube defects, often referred to as NTDs. Now, there are different neural tube defects, and I certainly am not an expert on this, but you've got one called hydrocephalus. We've got fluid on baby's brain, dreadful problem. And then you have a very common neural tube defect, or the most common of them, and that is spina bifida. And babies born with spina bifida, it's noticeable that at the base of spine there's actually a hole where the spine hasn't fused, with the bones at the top of the coccyx. And we couldn't possibly say that we've studied home economics for Leaving Cert and not be aware of that. The third one I'm going to go for then is thought to reduce the risk of heart attacks and strokes. Now, you could just learn that, or you could know that folic acid or folate can lower homocysteine in blood. There was a book written a number of years back called The H Factor, and I suppose groundbreaking information that the level of homocysteine in our blood can be, can say that we are predisposed. So the higher the level of homocysteine in our blood, the more predisposed we are to heart disease. And we know that folic acid, can actually reduce that. So there are 3. Deficiency, we're going to have to say a neural tube defect. So I'm going with that, and the most common one there being spina bifida. I'm going to have to say anemia because of the connection between folic acid with B6, B9 and B12, and it's macrocytic anemia again, which I'm going to highlight there. So a lack of B6 and a lack of B9, the type of anemia is called macrocytic. And the third one I'm going to go for then is, what am I going to go for? Choices are so huge. I'm going to go with can affect the growth and repair of cells. But to be honest with you, I would know the link with anemia and the neural tube defects first and foremost. 3 properties: easily destroyed in cooking, water soluble, and bread soda, the alkali, can increase the loss of folic acid. Remember we said when we were talking about B1 that some people will add bread soda and alkali to greens when they're cooking to keep that bright, vibrant colour, because greens, after they've been cooked, if they're left hanging around or if they're, kept warm, they turn a type of a yellow colour, but the bread soda keeps that bright green colour. But you might still be eating tissue paper regarding your B1, your folic acid, folate in content. And lastly then, our RDAs, or we can call them our RDIs. Now, they're very easy. I'm just going to write here 200 micrograms, 300 micrograms, and 400 micrograms. So that is a child, an adult, and pregnant. I think it's probably the easiest one. I was actually disappointed that they didn't ask for an RDI or RDA on the Leaving Cert 24 because they were just so easy to learn and would have been a super one for those that had really studied the vitamins very well. Right, cobalamin then, our last B vitamin. Now cobalamin came up in 2009. So to be honest, of the 3 of them, this is one we'd keep an eye on. It was on question 1B. We'd no choice, we had to answer it. And it was 26 marks, so 5% of the exam, more actually, was on vitamin B9. Cobalamin was linked with vegetarianism in that question. Why? Because something unusual, I suppose, or unique about this particular B vitamin is that it's only present in animal protein foods. We do not find cobalamin present in foods of plant or vegetable origin. Now that's quite significant for people who are following vegetarian diets. But as we go through our chapter of vegetarianism, we note that there are various different types of vegetarian. We have a pescatarian, eats no fish. A pescatarian only eats fish from animal origin. We've got an ovo-vegetarian, they only eat eggs. We've got a lacto-vegetarian, only has milk and milk products, a lacto-ovo, milk and eggs and milk products, and so on. So for each of those types of vegetarian, you're not worried about a deficiency of B12. However, the vegan, as we know, is a vegetarian who eats absolutely no animal produce in their diet, and they potentially could be lacking in B12. So it's very, very important, regardless of how good your diet is or how knowledgeable you are as a vegan, you do need to make sure you have vitamin B12 supplements and you take them daily in your diet. Remember, B vitamins, vitamin C are water soluble vitamins. We can't store water soluble substances in our body, and we have to have that daily supply. Now we're going to learn 6 sources. These are easy. So eggs, milk products, fortified food, meat, and dried edible seaweed. So those of you like sushi, just to know that the nori that wraps up the rice and fish and vegetables is high in vitamin B12. Now just if we move over here, if I were asked potentially for sources of B12, don't just list the foods. I'm always wary of the sources of a vitamin, because back in 2019, or a mineral for that matter, in 2009 for calcium, they marked the sources 210. So if students wrote down milk and cheese and green leafy vegetables and tinned fish, they only got 1 mark for each. They wanted 3 sources, 2 marks each, 210. You had to say milk products, cheese. You had to say green leafy vegetables, cabbage or kale. You had to say tinned fish, for example, salmon. So we just want to be careful here. Now in 2024 sources of folic acid, you could list them, but who's to say marking schemes are not consistent. So just be careful, because it hasn't been asked in 16 years. I would write down eggs, I would write down meat, I would write down fish, and then I would take, say, eggs could be chicken or duck eggs, meat could be beef or lamb, fish, tuna or salmon, then milk and milk products. We're going with, say, cheese or yogurt to get the idea. So we'll just then highlight the eggs, the meat, the fish, milk and milk products. Another one then would be fortified food. So we'll take that as our, so fortified food, where B12 is added, and one of those would happen to be breakfast cereal. TVP, which we'll talk about, textured vegetable protein, right, or full word. And then you have nori, textured vegetable protein, and our nori then, which is our edible seaweed. So you could have seaweed crisps, which some people like to eat, full of iodine as well. And if you're eating sushi, wrapping, it's the wrapping on the sushi, the nori. So just be careful. That's what I would do there. Next, moving on, we're going to learn, as always, 4 functions, 4 deficiency, 4 properties. So obviously I'm going to go with the one that's connected with the blood. So it works with B6, folic acid and iron to make red blood cells. Formation of the myelin sheath on nerve fibres. So if we just move on there. Now, what is the myelin sheath? So those of you studying biology will be aware of what's called the axon, which is a nerve fibre. Now, for those that don't do biology, the analogy I use would be, you know the way you'd have a flex and you'd have got the plastic insulation on the outside and the copper wire is running in the middle. Imagine the nerve fibre is the copper wiring and the plastic on the outside of the flex is the myelin sheath. So it's this fatty sheath, and the same way the plastic insulates the copper wiring on a flex, the fatty sheath insulates the nerve fibres. And I always think, if you have a little picture, an image in your mind, well, that's how my brain works anyway, which we won't go there. So myelin sheath, or it's also called fatty sheath. And what I'm saying to you is vitamin B12 is essential to make that myelin sheath, and it's a second significant point. We're also going to go with fat and carbohydrate metabolism. So that would say, as we'd expect, that B12 happens to be a coenzyme. We're not surprised with that because coenzymes, that's a characteristic function of all B vitamins. And we'll go with one other one there, which we'll highlight, and that is helps treat pernicious anemia. And I'm just going to write beside that B12 injections, which we'll explain briefly. B12 injections. Right, now deficiency, pernicious anemia. Now I hope you've realised there that we're mentioned two types of anemia today, macrocytic and pernicious. So macrocytic, lack of B6, lack of B9, larger red blood cells, fewer in number, they carry less hemoglobin. Whereas with pernicious anemia, it's due to lack of B12, and I just need to change that there now. And all forms of anemia have similar symptoms: tiredness, fatigue, lethargy, inability to exercise normally, paleness of skin, dizzy spells, headaches. And the other thing then is another characteristic of anemia we'll be looking at in the chapter on minerals is a condition called glossitis. So we will come back to that again. Then we're going to, please no pernicious anemia, I'm going to mark that there. Because there was a short question asked back in 2004. You had to list the symptom of a deficiency of the following. It was 2 marks. Pernicious anemia was the answer to a lack of B12. If you wrote anemia, you got 1. If you wrote pernicious anemia, you got 2. And that's what we mean by the detail. Secondly, we're going to highlight there reduced number of white blood cells, so there's an increased susceptibility to infection, memory loss and mental confusion. Now some old people, present with memory loss and confusion, and sometimes people jump to the conclusion, that they're early signs of dementia. If a blood test is taken, which obviously a GP would do first, the person in question, the elderly person, might just be lacking in B12 and have this pernicious anemia, which can lead to mental confusion and memory loss. Because they're living on their own, they mightn't have the motivation to cook properly, and also many old people or elderly people have restricted budgets and they can't afford to be buying a lot of the high protein, high biological value protein foods. So that's a very common thing that can happen. And then of course we have loss of appetite. Our 4 properties we just learned: water soluble, sensitive to light, destroyed by strong acid and alkali, and heat stable to 100 degrees centigrade. So that's not very clear there, so just make sure that you mention centigrade. RDAs, you can learn 3. So we'll go with child, teen and adult. Now, I would go 0.7 to 1 microgram, then 1 to 1.4 microgram, and then 1.4. And how I remember that is 0.7 multiplied by 2 is 1.4. However you get it into your brain, the syllabus says that we need to learn these recommended daily intakes, or RDAs as they've been known in the past. So you'll be glad to know there are only 6 of them, and we've covered all 6. Our next lesson we'll be looking at our final water soluble vitamin, and that is vitamin C ascorbic acid.